Public schools, private schools, charter schools, Montessori schools, the list of school options just goes on. Yet, do you understand the broader implication of your school choice for your child? My name is Esme. I am a senior at School Without Walls High School, and in my podcast, I will explain to you how public and charter schools are funded and why your school choice impacts this. My podcast includes interviews with a DCPS principal and 2 DCPS students to provide a wider range of information and opinion so I can help you make an informed decision. I will be discussing 4 main points. 1. The loss of enrollment in DC public schools to charter schools. 2. How this loss in funding impacts public schools. 3. How defunding charter schools poses a solution. And 4. How your decision can make a difference. Well, you may be wondering how to define a charter school separately from a public school. Charter schools are an alternative education option in which there is no tuition, but they are managed by a charter management organization which is independent from the local district. Think of it almost as a hybrid between public and private schools. Many charter schools are even nationwide establishments. You may have heard about KIPP DC or Basis DC. These schools are 2 examples of DC charter schools that are part of a greater system, each with their own initiatives. No excuses, increased rigor, or Montessori are only some of the options that charter schools provide. However, unlike private schools, charter schools receive federal funding despite managing their own oversight. Now, you may be wondering how public and charter schools are funded. Well, both public and charter schools get funding from federal, state, and local revenue. Locally, in terms of DC, the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula, or UPSFF, is used to fund both public and charter schools. This system sets aside an equal, or base weight, amount of money per student enrolled. Additional funds are added based on the needs of specific students. This can be related to special education or English language learner services. This means that when a student enrolls in a public school, the school gains funding, and the same goes for charter schools as well. To further discuss DCPS funding and the effects that it has on schools, I will now play a recording of an interview with Principal Lutz of Stoddard Elementary School, who provides a professional overview on public school funding. Would you say just having a higher student input in schools makes a difference in terms of funding?
Yes, so DCPS is 100% enrollment based.
Yeah.
So the more kids you have, the more money you get. And then you also get extra money for, various, so if a student is special education, you get extra money. We get extra money for ECE for the little guys. So yes, more students, yes, more money. Yeah.
That was definitely something I found that kind of became like a bigger part of my paper. I think it was like the Uniform Per Student Funding Formula. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is interesting, but so not all school districts follow that same model?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you look around, and we're also unique because lots of school districts will have their city funding, their county funding, and then their state funding, whereas we just have our city funding and then the federal funding. But yeah, our formula, every school district does it a little bit different. And we recently changed the funding formula a couple of years ago too. So there's no perfect formula.
Yeah.
I think we're getting better. DCPS also does, once you hit certain benchmark. So once you get up to 400 kids in an elementary school, you also get an assistant principal. There are certain things that they also sort of give you based on the number of kids too. So yes, more kids definitely equals more dollars. Yeah.
And so do you think in areas where maybe more students would be attending charter schools versus public? Because I noticed, I think it was in Southeast a lot, like there is higher enrollment in charter schools than public in certain areas.
Yes.
And that affects the school badly?
Yes, that's a great example of families who are choosing to go not to the public school and it limiting the enrollment there. We did any of your research show you how many kids are actually in boundary at schools? Because I would also say that Ward 7 and 8, for example, they're also competing with schools in Ward 3 who let in students off the wait list, right? So not only do they have the charter schools to compete with, but they have schools in Ward 3.
I remember at Deal and then Jackson Reed also, definitely.
Yes, yeah. So that's another part too that because there is the lottery and there is some school choice, is that some schools in some parts of the city are getting it from charters, privates, and their own public schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
As mentioned in the interview, less enrollment leads to less funding. This can have severe implications on under-enrolled schools, such as public schools in Wards 7 and 8. Less funding means being able to support less teachers and less programs for special education or English language learners. Particularly, as these schools are facing deficits in these areas, even more parents look to send their children to charter schools, which causes a further loss for the public school. For example, in Ward 8, under 50% of students are enrolled in a school in their ward of residence, whereas in Ward 3, just over 80% are. This means that over 50% of Ward 8 students are attending charter schools or other public options outside of their ward, which is in turn taking away funding from those public schools. If charter schools were defunded, many of these students would attend their neighborhood schools instead. This would lead to an increase in enrollment, which would lead to an increase in funding. Instead of having students leaving the public school system to seek out charter schools as a quote-unquote better option, having charter schools defunded would allow the public school system to grow and improve. These schools could hire more teachers, they could improve special education and English language learner programs, and they could even add funding to extracurriculars, everything that could add and contribute to a well-rounded education for all. Now, you may be wondering what this loss in funding can mean for public schools and why it's so important to protect against. Next, I will speak with fellow classmates on our school's experience on this matter. I am here with Anna Mayer and Bronwyn Burns in order to give a student perspective on what budget cuts can do to a public school. Do either of you want to start out with explaining what happened last year?
Sure, I can start. So last year we had an incident at School Without Walls where the administration and HSA and various powers that be were talking about cutting 2 departments from the program at Walls, the Chinese department and the theater department. And these cuts were due to larger citywide budget cuts to schools. There was a big controversy last year because the district lost federal COVID funding that we had been getting because of the pandemic that we stopped getting for fiscal year, at that point, 2024, because the pandemic was over, which meant that schools were not necessarily in a deficit, but having less resources than they had compared to the previous year, I guess. That meant that there were different areas from different schools that were being cut, and Walls was one of those schools. And many students and faculty were really, really upset about the cuts because the Chinese department and the theater department were seen as instrumental to the Walls community. So many students and community members, including myself, testified before the council and advocated to keep those departments, which ended up happening thanks to an act by Ward 2 council member Brooke Pinto. And I will say, Walls School Without Walls was really privileged to get to keep those 2 positions and those 2 departments. Many other schools weren't, and in a lot of ways, this was another instance of academic inequity in the district because School Without Walls, which is a predominantly white magnet institution, was able to, we limited how we felt the citywide consequences while other schools didn't have the same luck or privilege. So while I am incredibly grateful that we got to keep those 2 teachers, I also think that it is an example of a much larger district issue.
Yeah, and I definitely think the issue of being able to keep teachers is one that I keep seeing come up, especially as enrollments for some public schools are dropping.
Yeah.
Because not only are you losing funds, but you're just losing the amount of students, student input. So you just can't keep teachers. You can't keep paying them the same amount of salaries, and you can't keep supporting these departments.
Yeah, and even without the question of salary, which was one of the biggest problems with the funding cuts last year, having schools that are underfunded makes it a lot harder to be a teacher, which then impacts teacher retention, which is already a crisis in DCPS. The teacher retention rates are abysmal compared to previous years and decades and compared to other places. So that itself is also an issue outside of salary, which obviously is always a problem for teachers.
Yeah, and Bronwyn, I know you were, very upset at these cuts last year, so do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah. My main thing is, even though they did bring back the departments, they couldn't bring back the teachers because, Ms. Z, our drama teacher, even though she was offered her job back, there's no guarantee that she's going to be able to keep it the next year. And second, she already had accepted a job because she was going to be out of one. And then administration just acted like it wasn't as big of a thing, even though it was really, it's difficult as a teacher to find a job in 5 months before the next school year starts. But yeah, I was very upset about that.
Yeah, and we definitely are lucky that School Without Walls was able to end up keeping these positions, because cutting an entire extracurricular activity, complete with classes as well, and then an entire language is a big deal, especially for students who are already maybe up to the, AP level. That could really impact their college applications and whatnot. But then also, just in general, you're able to offer less as a school, which could impact admissions and all sorts of things. And from there on, enrollment, which, as we know, is a huge issue for schools right now. As brought up in our discussion, every school can face budget cuts. Despite these cuts being on the minimal side compared to other schools, you can see how cutting even 2 departments is a massive problem that was met with a lot of resistance. School Without Walls was lucky to regain those 2 positions, but other schools were not as fortunate. For example, as the enrollment in public schools in wards 7 and 8 continued to decrease, the funding decreases as well. These schools will face further budget cuts than schools like School Without Walls did. It is possible that programs past the Chinese and theater departments could be cut. According to the DC Fiscal Policy Institute, 96% of schools in wards 5, 7, and 8 lost staff, ranging from classroom teachers to custodial and other support staff based on the budget cuts from last year. This is a huge problem, which will only get worse as enrollment drops due to charter schools. So, what is the solution to this exactly? Well, as previously stated, defunding charter schools eliminates competition, which would cause improvements in public schools, as the increase in enrollment would cause an increase in funding. But what would public schools do with more funding? How would this improve public education? In terms of schools that are suffering with the lowest enrollment rates, more teachers could be hired as the school could support paying more salaries. This could mean having extra teachers in the classroom or even the option to offer more courses. This would improve the quality of education as more teachers can help offset teacher burnout, which, as mentioned in this discussion, is a huge issue in DCPS right now. Along with hiring more teachers is hiring more special education or ELL coaches, which makes education more accessible for all students. With the increase in enrollment, schools with a lower population could even hire assistant principals after having over 400 students enrolled. This would help schools from an administrative point of view. Additionally, more funding could mean more extracurricular programs or activities which would provide a well-rounded education and inspire others to enroll, which would only improve the school further. Now, I'm sure you're wondering how you can help with the issue. Unfortunately, voting initiatives involving defunding charter schools are few and far between. I do urge you, if the occasion were to occur that this issue went to a vote, to always vote in support of public education, even if that does mean voting to defund charter schools. However, there are ways you can help in the meantime. One of the best ways to solve a problem is by not contributing to it further. By making the informed decision to send your child to a public school rather than a charter school, you are choosing to put funding towards that system and helping that system in the process. No school decision for your child is easy, but by adding to the enrollment, by sending your child to a public school, you can be confident that you are contributing to the public education system and thereby helping that very school you chose, as well as many other students. In conclusion, charter schools pose a threat to public schools as the competition based on enrollment and the funding formula results in public schools losing funding and facing higher budget cuts. Defunding charter schools is a solution to this problem, as many of the students who are attending charter schools would instead enroll in public schools and therefore increase funding. With more funding, public schools could hire more teachers, improve special education and English language learner programs, introduce new courses, or even add to extracurriculars, thereby adding to the well-rounded education that a public school provides. If an initiative on defunding charter schools arises, I implore you to vote in favor of defunding charter schools, but in the meantime, by sending your child to your local public school, you are already making a difference by providing further funding. I urge you to consider this when deciding which school to send your child to in the future. Quality public education leads to a well-educated society. Please consider being a part of this movement. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. I hope you enjoyed.